The Hells Angels biker saw the little girl pull a rusted tin from a boiler closet, and its contents should have stayed buried. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get started. On a cold, gray afternoon, Jake Reaper Morrison, a seasoned Hells Angels biker, roared down the road in his Harley-Davidson, the wind whipping past him as the familiar hum of his bike kept him company. He had seen it all, the rough, the brutal, and the unforgiving. But that day, something was different. As he passed an old, decrepit house at the edge of town, he heard a faint noise, almost a whisper, coming from inside. His instincts kicked in, and despite his usually cold demeanor, curiosity tugged at him. He pulled over, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached the house. The front door was cracked open, but there was no movement inside. Hesitating for just a moment, Jake pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in protest. What he saw inside would change everything. A small girl, no older than 8, was crouched in front of an old boiler closet, her hands trembling as she reached for something buried beneath the dust and rust. The room smelled of old wood and mildew, and the dim light from the cracked windows made it feel like the air itself was heavy with secrets. She pulled out a rusted tin, its surface covered in layers of grime and age. She didn't seem to notice Jake watching her, her focus entirely on the tin. Jake's heart skipped a beat. There was something about the way she handled it, almost like she was trying to uncover a hidden truth. As she pried open the tin, a small, crumpled piece of paper fell out, followed by a few photographs. The instant the paper touched the floor, Jake felt an eerie chill run down his spine. The pictures, though old and faded, were unmistakable. Faces he had not seen in years, faces he hoped he would never see again. The girl's eyes flicked up, locking with Jake's for the first time. There was a moment of pure silence between them, the kind that only exists in the presence of something far bigger than either of them could have anticipated. Jake's mind raced. What was this child holding? What had she just uncovered? He knew enough about the past to recognize that some things were better left buried. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary find. As he stepped closer, the girl looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "It's not just a story, you know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. This is real." Jake's heart sank as the weight of her words hit him. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew one thing for certain. The contents of that tin should have stayed buried. Jake stood frozen, staring at the small girl who had just uncovered a secret long buried. His eyes moved from her innocent face to the rusted tin she had pulled from the boiler closet. The photographs scattered across the floor seemed to flicker with a life of their own, as if they were calling out to him, pulling him back to a past he thought he had left behind. His mind raced as he quickly crouched down, his hand reaching for one of the photos. It was old, faded with age, but unmistakable. The image showed a group of men standing together, their faces hard and weathered, but one of them was instantly recognizable to Jake. It was a man he once knew, a man he had called his brother. He swallowed hard, his chest tightening with the weight of the memory. Jake had thought those days were over. He had left the Hells Angels behind, left all the violence and chaos in the rearview mirror. But now, in this dusty old house, the past was coming back to haunt him. The little girl's voice broke through his thoughts. "I don't think I was supposed to find this," she said, her words quiet but filled with an eerie certainty. Jake turned to her, his heart beating faster. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The girl hesitated for a moment, her eyes glancing nervously at the photos and the tin. "I found it in the closet," she said, "but my dad always told me not to touch anything in there." Jake's brows furrowed. There was more to this than she was letting on. "Who's your dad?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. "Why does he care about something so old?" The girl bit her lip, her eyes darting toward the door. "My dad isn't around much," she said softly. "He works all the time, but when he does come home, he's different. He gets really angry when he talks about the people in these pictures." Jake could feel the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but everything about this situation felt wrong. The tin, the photographs, and the girl's strange connection to it all. There was a story here, and Jake needed to know what it was. "Is your dad home now?" Jake asked, standing up slowly. The girl shook her head, her long brown hair falling into her face. "No, he's at work. He won't be back until late." Jake nodded, his mind already racing with the possibilities. He had seen enough in his life to know when something was off, and this whole situation reeked of trouble. He stood up, his hand still gripping the photo of the man he once knew. "I think I need to talk to your father," Jake said, his voice firm. The girl looked up at him, her wide eyes filled with fear. "I don't think that's a good idea," she whispered. "He's not like you. He's dangerous." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low growl. The girl backed up a step, her eyes darting nervously. "I don't know, but he always says we shouldn't talk about the people in the photos," she said, her voice trembling. Jake paused, the pieces of the puzzle clicking together in his mind. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. There was something about this house, about this girl, and about the tin that felt like a warning. "All right," Jake said, his voice calm but resolute. "You stay here. I'm going to find out what's going on, but you need to be careful. Don't tell anyone you found this, especially your father." The girl nodded, her face pale. Jake stepped toward the door, his hand resting on the doorknob as he looked. "Back one last time." "I'll be back," he said, before pushing the door open and stepping out into the quiet evening. The wind blew through the trees, the air thick with the smell of rain. Jake's mind raced as he walked down the street, his thoughts focused on the man in the photos and the girl's cryptic words. Something was going on in this town, and Jake had a feeling he was about to uncover a secret that would change everything. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to stop until he got them. Jake stood in front of the old house, his leather jacket heavy with the weight of the night's events. The girl's words echoed in his mind. "He's dangerous." The air was thick with tension as Jake paced in front of the house, trying to piece together what was going on. The photograph in his hand felt like it was burning through his fingers, the faded faces of his former brothers in arms haunting him. There was no way he could walk away from this. Something was off, and he knew it. He couldn't let this go. Jake wasn't a man who left loose ends. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside him. He needed information, and the only way to get it was to confront the one person who could answer all his questions, the girl's father. But the fear in the girl's voice kept nagging at him. She had warned him, but Jake wasn't the kind of man to back down. He wasn't afraid of trouble. As he walked toward the back of the house, his mind raced through the possible scenarios. He had been in plenty of dangerous situations in his time, facing off with rival gangs, dealing with law enforcement, even surviving the brutality of his former brothers. But this felt different. This felt personal. He reached the back door, his hand resting on the old wooden frame, his thoughts focused on the task ahead. He had no idea what he would find, but he knew he couldn't let the girl be caught in whatever web of lies her father had spun. The door creaked open, and Jake slipped inside. The house was silent, the only sound the distant hum of traffic outside. He moved cautiously, his boots barely making a sound on the old wooden floors. As he approached the living room, Jake noticed the faint smell of cigarette smoke lingering in the air, a reminder of the past that still clung to the house. The room was cluttered, filled with old furniture and photographs that lined the walls, but it was the man sitting in the corner that caught Jake's attention. He was a tall figure, his back turned toward Jake as he sat in a worn-out armchair, a half-empty bottle of whiskey resting on the table beside him. Jake could see the muscles in the man's shoulders tense as he heard the door open, his eyes narrowing as he slowly turned around to face Jake. "Who the hell are you?" the man growled, his voice rough and gravelly. Jake didn't flinch. He had faced worse. "I'm here to talk," Jake said calmly, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. The man's eyes flicked to the photograph in Jake's hand, then back to his face. For a moment, there was a tense silence, the kind of silence that only existed in the presence of two men who knew they were about to face off. "That's none of your business," the man muttered, his hand reaching for the bottle. But Jake wasn't here to play games. "I think it is," he said, taking a step closer. The man's eyes widened slightly. Then he sneered, showing a mouth full of crooked teeth. "You don't know who you're messing with," he spat, standing up slowly, his fists clenching. Jake didn't back down. "I think I do," he said. The tension in the room was palpable, the two men sizing each other up, measuring each other's strength. Jake could feel the anger building inside him, but he kept it in check. This wasn't about violence. It was about answers. The man took a step toward Jake, his face contorted in rage. "You don't want to do this," he warned, his voice low and threatening. But Jake didn't flinch. "I don't want to, but I will," Jake said, his voice colder than ever. The man hesitated for a moment, then sat back down in his chair, his eyes burning with fury. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice strained. Jake took a breath, his mind still spinning with questions. "I want to know about the photographs," Jake said, holding up the image of the man from the old photo. "What's your connection to the people in these pictures?" The man's face twisted in anger, then quickly shifted to something darker. His eyes flicked to the corner, where the girl had been standing just moments before, then back to Jake. "You shouldn't have come here," the man said, his voice barely a whisper. "You don't know what you're getting into." Jake's grip on the photograph tightened. "I think I know more than you think," he said, his voice low. The man stood up again, his expression cold. "You need to leave," he said, his voice final. But Jake wasn't about to back off now. "Not until I get answers," he said. The man's eyes flashed with something Jake couldn't quite read, but he could see the fear hidden behind the anger. There was more to this than the man was letting on, and Jake was determined to find out what it was. Jake stood his ground, watching the man with a cold intensity. The words, "You don't know what you're getting into," echoed in his mind. Jake had heard those words before, from people who thought they could intimidate him into walking away. But he wasn't about to back down. Not now, not with everything on the line. The man across from him, the one who had been hiding behind a veil of anger and deflection, was now visibly shaken. There was something more to this than just old photos and dusty boxes. The man's hands shook slightly as he reached for the whiskey bottle again, his gaze flicking nervously to the door. It was as if he was expecting someone, or something, to walk through that door at any moment. Jake wasn't about to let him off the hook. "Who are you really?" Jake asked, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "What's your connection to the people in those pictures?" The man clenched his jaw, his face hardening. He wasn't going to answer easily. "I told you," the man said, his voice low and strained. "That's none of your business." Jake took a step forward, his boots making a soft thud against the wooden floor. The man flinched, but Jake didn't stop. "It is my business now," Jake said firmly. "You've got something I want, and I'm not leaving here until I get it." The man's eyes darted to the window, his panic now visible in the way his body tensed. It was clear to Jake that the man was hiding something big, something he was scared of. "You think you can just come in here and demand answers?" The man spat, his voice rising. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Jake's patience was wearing thin. "Then tell me," he pressed, "what am I dealing with?" The man took a deep breath, as if weighing his options. Jake could see the struggle in his eyes, the internal battle between keeping the secrets and revealing everything. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the man spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand," he said, looking away as if ashamed. "It's not just the Hells Angels. It's bigger than that." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "Bigger than that," he repeated. "What are you talking about?" The man sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. "There are people who will do anything to protect what's hidden," he said, his voice shaking. "Those photos you found, they're just the tip of the iceberg. There's more, so much more." Jake's mind raced as the man continued. He could feel the weight of the situation growing heavier with each passing second. "Who are these people?" Jake asked, his voice low but intense. The man shook his head. "I can't tell you," he muttered. "If I do, they'll come after you. They'll come after both of us." Jake's eyes narrowed. "Who are they?" The man's face grew pale as he looked at Jake, the fear in his eyes now unmistakable. "The ones behind everything. The ones who control the money, the power, the people. They're the ones who made sure that Tin never saw the light of day." Jake clenched his fists, the frustration rising inside him. "Who are they?" he demanded again, his voice hard. The man opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say another word, the front door slammed open. Both men froze. A figure stepped into the room, tall and imposing, dressed in dark clothing and wearing a mask of indifference. Jake instinctively reached for his jacket, his fingers brushing the handle of the gun tucked beneath his leather. The man in the chair looked up, his eyes widening in recognition. "You," he started, but the words died in his throat. The newcomer's gaze shifted to Jake, sizing him up. "I don't think you're in the right place, friend," the figure said, his voice cold. Jake didn't flinch. He wasn't going to be intimidated. "I'm just getting started," Jake said, his voice steady. The newcomer took a step forward, his posture tense. "You should have left when you had the chance," he warned. Jake's eyes never left the man. "I'm not going anywhere until I get the answers I came for," he said, his voice unwavering. The tension in the room thickened, the air charged with an almost palpable sense of danger. The man in the chair shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught between fear and a desire to protect his secrets. The newcomer let out a low chuckle. "You have no idea what you're up against," he said, taking another step forward. "But I'm afraid you're too far gone now." Jake didn't back down. "Then I guess we'll see," he said, his voice hard and determined. The silence that followed was heavy, the room charged with an energy that could explode at any moment. Jake had no idea who this new figure was, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to leave without the truth. And whatever this man knew, Jake was going to get it out of him. Jake stood his ground, eyes locked on the newcomer, whose cold stare seemed to pierce through him. The tension in the room was palpable, as if the very air around them had become thick with uncertainty and danger. The man standing before him was unlike any threat Jake had faced before. He wasn't just a thug or a rival gang member. This man had something far more dangerous about him, a calmness that made him unpredictable. Jake's instincts told him that this was the kind of person who could kill without hesitation, without remorse. But Jake wasn't afraid. His time in the Hells Angels had hardened him, made him unflinching in the face of danger. He wasn't about to let this person intimidate him. "Who are you?" Jake demanded, his voice steady, though his body was ready for whatever came next. The man's lips curled into a faint smirk, but his eyes remained icy. "You don't need to know," he replied, his voice low, almost too calm. "You're in over your head, biker. This isn't a game." Jake wasn't buying it. He knew there was something more to this, something that connected this man to the girl, to the photographs, and to the tin. Everything felt like a puzzle, and Jake was determined to put it together. "I'm here to get answers," Jake said, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "And I'm not leaving until I do." The man took a step forward, his posture still relaxed but his hands ready. "You think you can just waltz in here, demanding answers, and walk out unscathed?" the man asked, his voice tinged with mockery. Jake didn't flinch. "I don't need to walk out unscathed," he said, his voice cold. "I just need to walk out with the truth." The room seemed to grow colder as the two men stood facing each other. The man glanced briefly at the photos on the table, then back at Jake. His smirk faded, replaced by a more serious expression. "You don't know what you're dealing with," the man said, his voice now a bit more serious. "You think this is all just about a tin and a few pictures? You have no idea how deep this goes." Jake's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, the moment he would finally get some answers. "Then tell me," Jake said, stepping closer. "Tell me how deep it goes." The man hesitated for a moment, and for the first time, Jake saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are people who would kill to keep these secrets buried." Jake's eyes narrowed. "Who are they?" he pressed. The man's eyes flicked toward the door again, his hands twitching as if he were expecting someone else to enter. "It's not just about us," the man said, his voice lowering to a whisper. "It's about power. Control. The kind of power that can change the course of everything." Jake felt his pulse quicken. This was bigger than he had imagined. The photos, the tin, the girl, they were all connected to something much larger. "Who's behind this?" Jake demanded. The man's gaze hardened, and he took a step back, as if he were about to make his exit. "You wouldn't understand," he said, his voice growing cold again. "You don't belong here. You're just a biker trying to dig up things you're not prepared to face." Jake wasn't about to let him walk away. "I'm not walking away," he said, his voice firm. "Not until I know everything." The man paused, considering Jake's words. Then, with a sudden movement, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black phone. He tapped something into the screen, and a few seconds later, the door to the room opened again. This time, it wasn't the man's ally Jake had been expecting, it was the girl. She stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. Jake's heart sank. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice softening. The girl stepped into the room, her eyes darting nervously between the two men. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, she whispered, her voice trembling. But now they know I found it. They know I touched it. Jake's stomach twisted. He had a sinking feeling that whatever was going on here, whatever secret was hidden in that tin, was about to explode. The man in the corner gave the girl a hard look, then turned back to Jake. You see, he said slowly, this is what happens when you start poking around in things you don't understand. You don't know who's watching, who's pulling the strings. And now you're involved. Both of you. Jake felt the weight of the situation press down on him. This wasn't just about a past he could walk away from. This was about a fight that was bigger than him, bigger than anything he had faced before. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back now. Jake stood still, the weight of the moment heavy on him. The girl's words still echoed in his ears. They know I touched it. His heart raced as he turned toward her. She looked fragile, scared, like she didn't belong in this world of shadows and secrets. But she was here now, wrapped up in something that could bring down far more than just the man in front of them. What did you find? Jake asked, his voice soft, trying not to scare her more than she already was. She hesitated, her small hands clenching and unclenching at her sides. I didn't mean to, she whispered, her voice trembling. I was just looking for something in the closet. It was so quiet, so dark. And then I saw the tin. I didn't know what it was, but when I opened it, I felt like something bad was going to happen. Jake stepped closer, lowering his voice. You're safe now, he assured her, though he wasn't sure how much longer that would be true. No one is going to hurt you. I'm here. The man who had been standing across the room scoffed, a sound that broke the tense silence. You think you're protecting her? He sneered. This goes far beyond you, biker. You've stirred up something you'll never be able to finish. Jake didn't flinch. He wasn't about to let this man intimidate him, not now. You're right about one thing, Jake said, his voice darkening. I'm in this now, and I'm not backing down. Not until I get the truth. The man narrowed his eyes, his face hardening. Truth. He laughed bitterly. Truth is something you won't be able to handle. The moment you open that tin, everything changed. You think you're going to just walk out of here like a hero? Like you've got all the answers? That's not how this works. Jake's pulse quickened. There was more to this, much more, and he knew the man wasn't just spouting off for the sake of it. There was something dangerous here, something the man was trying to hide. I don't care how deep this goes, Jake said, his voice low and determined. I'm getting to the bottom of this, and I'm starting with you. The man took a deep breath, his eyes flicking toward the door again. Jake followed his gaze and noticed for the first time that the door was slightly ajar, a shadow moving outside. Someone else was coming. The man seemed to notice Jake's shift in focus, and his expression darkened. You don't know who you're messing with, he said again, this time more urgently. They'll kill you. They'll kill her. No one is safe when they're watching. Jake didn't react. He was already reaching for his jacket, his hand brushing against the cold metal of his gun. He didn't want to draw it. Not yet, but he was ready. Whoever was out there, he wasn't about to wait for them to make their move. The man started to speak again, but before he could finish, the door opened fully, and another figure stepped inside. Jake's hand tightened on the handle of his gun as he assessed the new arrival. This man wasn't like the others. His posture was relaxed, almost bored, but Jake could sense the danger radiating off him. Well, the new figure said, his voice smooth and calm. Looks like we've got a little party going on here. Jake didn't lower his guard. Who are you? He demanded, his eyes scanning the man for any hint of threat. The newcomer didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped further into the room, his eyes flicking between Jake and the man sitting at the table. I'm just here to make sure things don't get too out of hand, the newcomer said with a smirk. You see, there are rules, and when people like you start breaking them, things get complicated. The tension in the room thickened. Jake knew this wasn't just another thug. This man had the air of someone who was in control, someone who had the power to make things happen. What's your interest in this? Jake pressed, his voice sharp. The newcomer smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. My interest, he repeated. Let's just say I'm here to make sure the right people stay safe. You don't belong in this mess, biker. You never should have gotten involved. Jake's mind raced. He knew the stakes had just risen. This wasn't just about the girl, the photos, or the tin anymore. There were bigger forces at play. I'm not leaving without answers, Jake said, his voice cold. The man's smile faded, replaced by something far more dangerous. I don't think you understand, he said quietly. You're already too deep. No one gets out once they're involved in this. The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He had known there was more to this story, but hearing it from this man confirmed what he had feared. There was no easy way out. Jake's thoughts flashed to the girl, still standing in the corner, watching the exchange. She's just a kid, Jake muttered under his breath. You really think they'll stop at nothing to protect her? The newcomer's eyes flicked to the girl, then back to Jake. She's part of it now, he said, his voice low. And that means she's not just a kid anymore. She's a target. The reality of what was happening hit Jake hard. This was no longer just a fight for answers. It was a fight for survival. Jake felt the air grow even thicker as the newcomer's words settled in. The man was right. There was no turning back now. The girl, who had once seemed so innocent, was now entangled in something far darker than Jake could have imagined. She was a target, and that made her a threat to everyone around her. The newcomer's eyes never left Jake, and there was a dangerous, almost mocking smile on his face. You think you can protect her? He asked, the amusement clear in his tone. You're already too deep, biker. You don't even know who you're dealing with. Jake's pulse quickened. His fingers instinctively brushed against the cold metal of the gun holstered under his jacket, but he kept his hands by his sides, refusing to give in to the tension. He wasn't going to draw unless he absolutely had to. The man took a step forward, his eyes flicking briefly to the girl in the corner before settling back on Jake. You're in over your head, he repeated, his voice low and threatening. You've got no idea what this whole thing is really about. The photos, the tin, it's just the beginning. Jake took a step forward himself, not backing down. Then explain it to me, he said, his voice firm, his eyes locked on the man in front of him. The newcomer smirked again, but it wasn't a smile of amusement this time. It was the kind of smile that sent a chill down Jake's spine. I don't owe you anything, the man said. But I'll tell you this much. There are people in this world who will do whatever it takes to keep their secrets safe. You don't just walk away from something like this. You don't get to pick sides. Jake clenched his fists, his jaw tight. I'm not picking sides, he said, his voice low. I'm making sure the truth comes out. The man's smirk faltered for a second, but only for a second. He quickly regained his composure, and his gaze flicked to the girl. Jake followed his gaze, his mind racing. She was still standing there, but her eyes were wide with fear, as though she understood that her involvement had just escalated everything. You shouldn't be here, Jake said softly to her, his voice gentler now. The girl didn't answer, but her eyes met his for a moment, a silent plea for reassurance. She had no idea how deep this went, how dangerous it had all become. I'm here to help you, Jake continued, keeping his voice steady. I won't let them hurt you. The newcomer chuckled darkly. You think you can stop them? He asked, almost amused by the thought. You're just a biker. You don't have the resources, the power, or the backing to go up against what's coming. Jake didn't flinch. I've been through worse, he said simply. The man's expression shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied Jake, sizing him up. You have no idea what you're dealing with, he said again, his voice quieter now, almost contemplative. The people who want that tin, they're not afraid of anyone. Not you, not me, not anyone. They don't care about rules or laws. They care about control. Jake's mind raced. He had heard about people like this before, shadow organizations, men and women who operated in the dark corners of the world, untouchable by the law. But this felt different. This was personal. And now, the girl, the photographs, and the tin had drawn him into their world. There was no going back. So what happens now? Jake asked, his voice hard. What happens to her? What happens to me? The man tilted his head slightly, his eyes flicking to the girl once more before returning to Jake. What happens now, he said slowly, is that you realize you're not in control anymore. They will come for her, for you, for everything. You'll wish you'd never stepped into this mess. Jake's heart raced as he weighed the man's words. There was a threat in the air, a sense of inevitability that Jake couldn't shake. But he wouldn't, back down. I don't care who they are, Jake said, his voice unwavering. I'm not going to let them get to her. The man laughed softly, a hollow sound that echoed in the silence. You're already too late, he said. You don't have the time you think you do. They'll be here soon, and when they come, it won't just be the girl who's at risk. Jake's stomach twisted. What are you talking about? He demanded. The man's smile was cold, empty. "The truth," he said, "is more dangerous than you think." Jake felt a shiver run down his spine. He had never been this far and over his head before. But one thing was clear. He wasn't going to stop until he uncovered everything. He wasn't going to let anyone, no matter how dangerous, destroy this girl's life. He'd fight, no matter what it took. The man's words hung in the air, cold and threatening, like a dark storm cloud settling over the room. Jake's pulse was pounding in his ears, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of something far more dangerous than anything he'd anticipated. The newcomer had just made it clear. The girl wasn't the only one at risk now. The stakes had just gone through the roof. But Jake wasn't the type to cower in the face of danger. He had lived his life by a code that didn't allow him to back down from a fight, no matter how deep the odds stacked against him were. He stared at the man, not blinking, not flinching. "You want to scare me?" Jake asked, his voice low but steady. "I've been through worse." The man's eyes flicked to the girl, who was still standing by the door, her wide eyes filled with fear. Her small frame trembled, but she said nothing. She had no idea what kind of world she had just stepped into, and Jake knew it wasn't his place to explain it all to her. She was already scared enough. The newcomer's lips twitched in a barely there smirk, but it didn't reach his eyes. "This isn't about scaring you, biker," he said, his voice colder now. "It's about survival. And you're not going to survive this if you don't know what you're up against." Jake's mind raced. There were so many things he didn't know about this situation, about the tin, the photographs, and the shadowy figures behind it all. But he was starting to realize that the truth was more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. "Who are they?" Jake asked, his voice hard. "Who the hell are you working for?" The newcomer didn't answer right away. He took a slow, deliberate step toward Jake, his movements calculated, his posture relaxed, but Jake could sense the danger in him. This was no ordinary thug. This was someone with control, someone who had power. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," the man said finally. "But you'll find out soon enough. You're too deep in this now." Jake clenched his jaw. He wasn't getting any real answers from this guy, and it was clear that if he was going to find out what was really going on, he'd need to take matters into his own hands. He couldn't afford to wait. "I'm not leaving until I know everything," Jake said, his voice unwavering. The man didn't flinch, but his eyes narrowed, as though he were sizing Jake up. Then, almost imperceptibly, the man's posture shifted. He looked at the girl, and for a brief moment, there was something in his gaze, a flicker of something like regret, or maybe even fear. But it disappeared as quickly as it had come. "You're wasting your time," the man said, his voice thick with menace. "You've already stepped into a game you can't win. They'll come for you. They'll come for her. No one is safe once they're involved." Jake's blood ran cold. He knew this wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. This was a war, and whether he was ready for it or not, he had already become part of it. But there was no turning back now. The man's words stuck with him as he turned to the girl. She was still standing there, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. He could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else there too. Something that made him realize she wasn't as helpless as she appeared. "You need to listen to me," Jake said softly, his voice reassuring. "They'll come for you, but I'll make sure they don't hurt you." The girl met his gaze, and for a moment, Jake saw something change in her eyes. It was as if she was trying to understand the gravity of the situation, trying to find a way to process it all. But before she could say anything, the man spoke again, his voice dripping with contempt. "You really think you can protect her?" he scoffed. "You're just a biker. You don't have the resources, the connections, to take on this kind of threat." Jake's eyes didn't leave the man's. "I don't need resources," he said quietly. "I just need to make sure she's safe. And you're in the way of that." The man chuckled darkly. "You think you can just walk in here, take what you want, and leave?" he asked. "You're a fool." Jake took a step forward, his body tense with resolve. "Maybe I am," he said, his voice low, "but I'm not going anywhere until I know the truth." The man's expression shifted, and for the first time, Jake saw a flicker of something like fear in his eyes. The newcomer took a deep breath, almost as if bracing himself. "Fine," he said at last, his voice cold. "You want the truth? You'll get it. But be careful what you wish for, biker. Some truths are better left buried." With those words, the man turned and walked toward the door. As he reached for the handle, he glanced back over his shoulder at Jake. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Then he was gone, leaving Jake alone with the girl. The room was silent, the weight of the man's words hanging heavily in the air. Jake's eyes met the girl's, and he gave her a reassuring nod. He didn't know what was coming next, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let anyone, not even the shadows of the past, take her down without a fight. Jake stood in the middle of the room, the weight of the man's warning still lingering in the air. His words echoed in Jake's mind. Some truths are better left buried. But Jake wasn't one to shy away from danger. He had already stepped into this world of secrets, of hidden dangers, and he wasn't about to turn back now. He looked over at the girl, her face still pale, her hands trembling slightly. She hadn't said much, but Jake could see the fear in her eyes. She was still processing everything, trying to make sense of the chaos that had been thrust upon her. "You okay?" Jake asked, his voice soft. She nodded slowly, but Jake could see she wasn't fully convinced. He didn't blame her. This wasn't the world she had imagined for herself. He had to find a way to protect her, to keep her safe from whatever was coming next. "We need to go," Jake said, his voice firm. He didn't have time to sit around and wait for whatever the man had been threatening. The longer they stayed here, the more dangerous it became. The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Where do we go?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake hesitated for a moment. He didn't have a perfect plan. He didn't know exactly who they were running from, but he knew they couldn't stay put. Not after what he'd just learned. "We'll figure that out," Jake said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "For now, we need to get out of here before things get worse." He walked toward the door, checking the hallway outside. It was quiet, too quiet. Jake could feel the tension in the air, like something was waiting just around the corner. He motioned for the girl to follow him, his steps silent as he moved toward the back door. They needed to get out before anyone else showed up. Jake could already hear the distant sound of cars in the street, the city alive with the usual hum, but it felt like everything had slowed down, like the world was holding its breath. As they reached the door, Jake paused, his hand on the handle. He glanced over his shoulder at the girl. "Stay close," he said, his voice low. She nodded, clutching her jacket tightly around her. With a deep breath, Jake opened the door, stepping out into the cold night air. The city was alive, but it felt different now. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound more pronounced. The quiet was gone, replaced by the feeling of being hunted. Jake glanced back at the house, knowing it wouldn't be long before someone else came looking. He had no idea who the newcomer had been working for, but Jake was certain he hadn't heard the last of him. "We need to get to a safe place," Jake said, his mind racing as he scanned the area. He didn't know where they were going yet, but he had to keep moving. He couldn't afford to stand still. The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Where are we going?" she asked again, her voice still shaky. Jake didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down the street, taking in the dimly lit buildings, the shadows stretching out before them. It wasn't a perfect plan, but he had to move them both before things got worse. "We'll find somewhere to hide for now," Jake said finally, his voice grim. "I'll figure out the next step, but we need to keep moving." The girl nodded again, her footsteps quickening to match his. They walked in silence, the weight of the night pressing down on them. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, that danger was closer than he realized. The city, once so familiar to him, now felt like a maze, full of hidden threats and unknown dangers. As they rounded a corner, Jake's instincts flared. He stopped dead in his tracks, listening intently. He heard it then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind them. Slowly, Jake turned to look over his shoulder. It was too dark to see clearly, but he could make out the faint silhouette of someone following them. Not just one person, but several. Jake's heart rate spiked as he scanned the street, his mind racing. The chase had begun. The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. "What's happening?" she whispered. Jake's grip on her arm tightened, pulling her closer. "Stay quiet," he whispered back. "Don't make a sound. They're after us." They quickened their pace, moving faster down the street, but the footsteps behind them grew louder. Jake's mind raced for options. He couldn't outrun them, not without knowing who they were or how many there were. He needed a plan, and fast. As they turned another corner, Jake spotted a narrow alley to their right. It was dark, hidden from the main road, but it offered them a chance to slip away without being seen. Without saying a word, Jake grabbed the girl's hand and pulled her into the alley, the cold brick walls closing in around them. They pressed themselves against the shadows, listening intently. The footsteps continued, but they had stopped just short of the alley. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he heard the sound of voices, low and urgent. The hunters were getting closer. They didn't have much time. "We need to move," Jake whispered, his voice tight. He didn't wait for a response before he started running again, pulling the girl with him. There was no more time for hesitation. Whatever was waiting for them in the dark, Jake knew he had to keep moving. The chase was on. Jake and the girl ran through the alley, their footsteps echoing against the brick walls, the shadows closing in around them. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He didn't know who was following them, but he knew they were getting closer. He could hear their voices growing louder, the sound of shoes scraping against pavement as the hunters closed in. The alley seemed to stretch on forever, but Jake's mind was focused only on one thing, getting them both to safety. He pulled the girl faster, his grip tight around her wrist, urging her to keep up. Her breath came in ragged gasps beside him, but she didn't complain. She was scared, Jake could see it in her eyes, but she was strong, and that gave him some hope. He glanced back over his shoulder, trying to keep his bearings. The alley was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of street lamps further down the road. They needed to get to the end of it, but they had to be quick. Jake wasn't sure how much time they had before the pursuers caught up with them. As they reached the end of the alley, Jake spotted a rusted gate, barely hanging on its hinges. It looked like it led to a narrow side street, a place they could disappear into. He didn't hesitate. "Through here," Jake hissed, pulling the girl toward the gate. She hesitated for a moment, but then followed him, her feet stumbling in the dirt. The gate creaked as they pushed it open, the sound too loud in the silence of the night. Once through, they ducked down, moving quickly into the side street, staying close to the shadows. Jake listened intently, trying to gauge how close their pursuers were. The street was eerily quiet, and for a moment, he allowed himself to breathe a little easier. But he knew it wasn't over. They were still being hunted, and they needed to move. "Keep low," Jake whispered to the girl, his voice urgent. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear, but she kept moving. They turned a corner, and Jake quickly scanned the area. He needed to find a way to shake the people on their tail, but his options were limited. He spotted a small, run-down building ahead, a bar with a flickering neon sign that read open. Jake knew they needed to blend in, to disappear, even if only for a moment. "We're going in there," Jake decided, nodding toward the bar. The girl didn't protest, but Jake could see the hesitation in her eyes. "Stay close," he told her again, his voice low. They moved quickly toward the door, and Jake pushed it open, stepping inside. The bar was dimly lit, the air heavy with the smell of stale beer and smoke. A few patrons sat at the counter, their voices low as they drank, unaware of the two newcomers slipping into the room. Jake's eyes scanned the interior, looking for an escape route. He didn't plan on staying long, but it was better than being out in the open. The bartender glanced up as they entered, his eyes narrowing slightly, but offering no immediate reaction. Jake gave a small nod, as if acknowledging him, and made his way toward the back of the bar. The girl followed closely behind, her movements cautious. Jake led her to a corner booth, where they slid into the shadows. The neon sign outside flickered weakly through the window, casting an eerie glow on the room. "Stay down," Jake instructed, keeping his voice low. The girl nodded, pressing herself against the wall. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them, that danger was closer than he wanted to admit. He scanned the bar again, making sure no one had noticed their arrival. His heart was still racing, his mind spinning. He had no idea what was going on, who was after them, or why. But one thing was clear, he couldn't trust anyone. The man from earlier, the one who had warned him, had been right about one thing. Things were about to get much worse. And Jake had no choice but to face it head on. Just then, the door to the bar swung open, and Jake tensed, his muscles coiling. He couldn't see who it was, but he could feel the tension rise in the room. The footsteps of the newcomer echoed across the floor, and Jake's eyes snapped to the door. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the silhouette of two figures standing in the doorway. They weren't looking directly at him, but Jake could feel their eyes scanning the room, checking for anyone who didn't belong. Jake didn't breathe, didn't move, as they passed by the booth where he and the girl were hiding. His hand instinctively went to his gun, but he held it tight, ready for whatever came next. The figures moved to the bar, ordering drinks, but Jake kept his eyes locked on them. He couldn't afford to be seen, couldn't afford to slip up. Everything depended on staying unnoticed, on not making a sound. Time seemed to stretch as the minutes passed. Jake knew they couldn't stay here forever. They had to keep moving, had to get out before their pursuers caught up. But for now, all they could do was wait. Wait for the right moment to slip away. Jake's mind raced as he planned their next move. Every step they took from here would have to be careful, calculated. If they weren't careful, they would be dead in the water. He couldn't let that happen. Not to him. Not to her. Jake sat motionless in the corner booth, the soft murmur of the bar swirling around him like a distant hum. He kept his focus on the two men who had just walked in, his senses heightened. They hadn't looked directly at him or the girl, but that didn't mean they hadn't noticed them. The flicker of suspicion in the air was enough to make Jake's heart race. His fingers rested on the edge of the table, his hand inches from his gun. He had no intention of pulling it unless he absolutely had to, but every part of him was prepared for whatever came next. The two men at the bar kept to themselves, but Jake didn't relax. He kept his gaze locked on them, assessing their every move. The bartender slid a glass across the counter to one of the men, their conversation low and unintelligible over the buzz of the bar. The tension in the room seemed to double as Jake's mind worked through their options. They couldn't stay here long. Every minute they waited was another minute the men had to catch on to their trail. Jake looked at the girl sitting beside him, her eyes wide and uncertain. She hadn't said anything in a while, but the fear in her eyes spoke volumes. "You okay?" Jake asked, his voice soft. The girl nodded, but it was clear she wasn't. She hadn't signed up for any of this, and now she was caught in a mess that was growing bigger by the second. The danger surrounding them was closing in, but Jake wasn't about to let that stop him. He'd fought through worse, and he wasn't about to back down now. The girl turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. "What happens next?" she asked, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Jake took a deep breath. "We keep moving. We find a way out of here." He said it with conviction, though his own mind was racing, running through scenarios, none of them good. He wasn't sure what their next move was yet, but one thing was certain. They couldn't stay here. Not with those two men in the bar. He glanced at the door. It was still open, the cool night air filtering in with each passing minute. The streets outside were quiet, but that didn't mean they were safe. They needed a plan, something that would get them out of the bar unnoticed. Jake scanned the room again, his eyes landing on the back door behind the bar. It was tucked away in the shadows, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. "We're going out the back," Jake muttered, his hand still resting on the edge of the table. The girl looked at him, her eyes flicking toward the back door, then back to him. "How?" she asked. Jake didn't answer immediately. He just watched the men at the bar for a moment longer. They were getting restless now, their conversation louder, more animated. That was their cue. "We wait for the right moment," Jake said quietly. He had to time this perfectly. If they made a move too soon, they'd get caught. But if they waited too long, it would be worse. The tension in the room was unbearable. Every second felt like a lifetime. The girl's breathing was shallow, her hands trembling. Jake placed his hand gently on her shoulder, giving her a reassuring squeeze. "We'll be fine," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. But he wasn't going to let her see the doubt in his eyes. They had to make it out of here. It was their only chance. The minutes dragged on, and finally, the two men at the bar stood up. Jake watched them, his heart pounding in his chest. He waited for them to turn their backs to the door. When they did, he gave the girl a nod. Without another word, they slipped out of the booth and moved toward the back door. Jake kept close to the shadows, staying as low as possible. The girl moved quietly beside him, her steps light but quick. They were almost to the door when Jake heard a voice behind him. "Where are you going?" The voice was low, sharp, and the tone was unmistakable. Jake froze. The voice had come from one of the men at the bar. They had been spotted. Jake didn't hesitate. Without turning around, he grabbed the door handle and yanked it open. The cold air hit them like a wall as they dashed out into the alley. The girl gasped, but Jake kept pulling her along, his feet pounding against the pavement. They couldn't afford to stop now. They had to get as far away as possible. "Stay close," Jake muttered, glancing over his shoulder. The sounds of footsteps followed them, but they were still a little distance away. Jake didn't slow down. They turned a corner, moving deeper into the dark streets, the shadows swallowing them whole. Jake's breath came in short bursts as he pulled the girl through the alleyways, his mind focused solely on getting them out of sight. He wasn't sure what came next, but he knew one thing for sure: they weren't safe yet. The city had changed overnight, and the danger was everywhere. But Jake wouldn't stop. Not until the girl was safe. And not until he uncovered the truth behind all of this. Jake's legs burned as he sprinted down the narrow alley, the cold air slicing through his lungs with every sharp breath he took. He didn't dare look back. He could hear the pursuit growing louder, the heavy footsteps echoing off the walls, closing in on them. They had gained some distance, but not enough. The girl was still right behind him, her breath coming in short gasps, but she was keeping pace. She didn't ask questions, didn't slow down, and Jake couldn't help but feel a strange sense of pride in her. She wasn't just a scared kid anymore. She was surviving, just like him. They turned another corner, and Jake's eyes scanned the streets ahead. The darkness of the night seemed to stretch endlessly, the city looming around them like a maze, full of threats at every turn. There was no clear path, no easy escape. He had no idea where they were going, but he needed to put more space between them and whoever was chasing them. The girl looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper as they continued to run. "Where are we going?" she asked, her eyes wide with uncertainty. Jake didn't answer immediately. His mind raced through options, none of them ideal. He wasn't prepared for this. He wasn't prepared to be hunted. He was used to the rough world of the Hells Angels, to dealing with enemies head-on. But this was different. "We need to find somewhere safe," Jake said finally, though he didn't know where that would be. They couldn't keep running forever. He needed to think fast. The streets ahead seemed empty, but Jake knew better than to trust that. The pursuit could be closing in from any direction. As they approached a dimly lit intersection, Jake's instincts flared. He could feel something, someone, watching them. He slowed, motioning for the girl to do the same. She hesitated, her eyes darting around, but she obeyed, her footsteps lightening as she mirrored his cautious movements. Jake scanned the area. There was a narrow, closed-off street to the left, lined with old warehouses, darkened windows staring back at him. It looked like the perfect place to hide, but it also felt like a trap. Still, it was their best option. Jake grabbed the girl's arm, pulling her towards the alley. They slipped through the shadows, staying low as they moved deeper into the darkness. The further they went, the more the city seemed to close in on them, the weight of the night pressing in from all sides. As they reached the back of a large warehouse, Jake crouched down behind a dumpster, motioning for the girl to do the same. They waited in silence, listening. The sound of their footsteps had faded, but Jake knew it wouldn't be long before their pursuers caught up. He needed to get out of here. He needed to find a way to lose them. The girl looked at him, her face pale in the dim light. "What now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake's mind raced. There was no easy answer. He could hear the sound of approaching cars, the low rumble of engines getting closer. Whoever was after them wasn't playing around. They were prepared. "We wait," Jake said softly. "We let them pass, then we move again." Quietly. The girl nodded, but Jake could see the fear in her eyes. She didn't understand how close they were to danger, how easily they could be found if they weren't careful. He wished he could tell her everything, make it all easier for her, but the truth was, he didn't even know what they were running from. He only knew one thing for sure. They couldn't stop now. "Stay close," he whispered. "Don't make a sound." The minutes felt like hours as they waited in the cold shadows. Jake's muscles ached from the constant tension, his fingers itching to grab the gun hidden beneath his jacket. But he held back. He didn't want to make a move unless it was absolutely necessary. The sounds of the cars grew louder, and Jake held his breath, trying to keep his body as still as possible. The girl was trembling beside him, but she was silent, following his lead. The cars passed, their headlights sweeping over the alley, but Jake didn't move. He waited until the sound of the engines faded before he dared to look out from behind the dumpster. It was clear. "For now. We go now," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. He stood, pulling the girl to her feet. They moved quickly, slipping between the buildings, their footsteps muffled against the cold concrete. They had to move fast before anyone else showed up. Jake's mind was already calculating their next steps. weighing the risks of each move. He didn't know how long they could keep running like this, but he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. They reached another street, and Jake stopped, looking both ways. The area was still eerily quiet, but something told him this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The chase wasn't just about running anymore. It was about survival, and Jake knew that the longer they stayed in this game, the more dangerous it would become. He had no idea who they were up against, or what they wanted with the girl, but he was determined to find out. He wasn't going to stop until the truth came to light. They couldn't keep running forever. It was time to make a stand. Jake kept his eyes fixed on the narrow street ahead. Every sound, every movement around him felt amplified in the still night air. They had made it out of the alley and into the shadows once more, but Jake knew that wasn't enough. The pursuit wasn't over. He could feel the weight of the girl's presence beside him, her footsteps matching his every move, but her breath was shallow, her fear palpable. It was clear she wasn't ready for the storm that had come crashing into her life. He couldn't blame her. She was just a kid. But Jake had seen too much to back down now. He had no choice but to keep moving, to push forward for both of them. He glanced around one more time, double-checking that no one was trailing them. The streets were quiet, but Jake's instincts told him that silence was dangerous. He couldn't afford to get comfortable. "We need to keep moving," Jake said quietly, his voice low but firm. The girl nodded, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and uncertainty. She had no choice but to follow, but Jake could sense that she was still processing everything. She was a long way from home, a long way from the normal life she'd once known. They kept walking, their footsteps echoing in the distance. The city had become a maze, and Jake knew it was only a matter of time before they ran into more trouble. But he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. After a few more blocks, they turned into a darker alley, where the city lights were dim and the shadows were deeper. Jake pulled the girl closer, keeping her shielded from any potential eyes. They moved swiftly, trying to avoid being seen, but then something caught Jake's attention. A figure standing in the shadows. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end as he froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun at his side. But before he could react, the figure stepped forward. Jake's eyes locked onto the man's face, his heart skipping a beat. It was the man from the bar, the one who had tried to warn him. "I thought you'd come back," the man said, his voice cold and emotionless. "I knew you wouldn't stop." Jake didn't move. He stood his ground, staring at the man, weighing his options. He couldn't trust this guy. Not anymore. "What do you want?" Jake asked, his voice tight, ready for anything. The man's eyes flicked to the girl, then back to Jake. "You really have no idea what you've gotten into, do you?" The man said, his voice almost pitying. "You're playing a dangerous game, and you're not the only one who's caught in it." Jake didn't answer. He could feel the tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. This wasn't just some random chase anymore. There was a bigger picture, and Jake was in the center of it. "What's going to happen now?" Jake asked, his tone low but steady. The man looked at him for a moment before he spoke again. "You've crossed a line," he said, his voice colder now. "And there's no turning back. The people behind all of this, they won't stop until they've cleaned up their mess. And right now, you're part of it." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. The realization sank in. He and the girl were more than just being hunted. They were in the middle of something much larger, something that couldn't just be outrun or fought off. Jake's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. Who were these people? Why had they targeted the girl? And what was it that he had uncovered that made them so dangerous? The man stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You think you're doing the right thing, but you're just making it worse," he said, his voice taking on a menacing tone. "You're both dead if you don't stop. Now." Jake didn't flinch. "I'm not stopping," he said, his voice filled with determination. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he wasn't going to let fear dictate his actions. The man studied him for a moment, his eyes cold. "Then you'll die for nothing," he said, turning his back on Jake. "The truth you're looking for isn't worth your life." With that, the man disappeared into the shadows, leaving Jake standing in the alley with the girl, the words lingering in the air. Jake turned to the girl, his heart heavy with the realization that they had no safe place to go. He didn't know what was coming, or how they would make it through, but he wasn't going to give up. Not now, not when they had come so far. "We keep moving," Jake said, his voice steady but firm. The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but she nodded. There was no other choice. With one final glance over his shoulder, Jake pulled the girl into the night, disappearing into the shadows once more. They didn't know what was ahead, but they knew one thing. They had to keep moving, or they would never make it out alive. Get ready for a thrilling ride through the world of danger and mystery in this intense story that dives deep into the heart of Hell Angel stories. A gritty biker and a young girl find themselves tangled in a web of deceit and hidden truths as they are pursued by deadly forces. As they race against time, they uncover a secret that could change everything. The stakes are high, and survival is uncertain. Hell Angel stories are filled with unexpected twists and turns, and this one is no exception. With danger lurking around every corner, will they make it out alive, or will the shadows claim them? This gripping tale explores the complexities of loyalty, danger, and the harsh realities of the biker world, making it a must-read for fans of Hell Angel stories. Follow the journey of a seasoned biker as he faces not only external threats, but also the weight of the past, all while trying to protect a girl caught in a nightmare she never saw coming. Hell Angel stories like this one remind us that some battles are fought not with weapons, but with resolve and determination. Will they escape the clutches of their enemies, or will they be swallowed by the darkness that follows them? Don't miss out on this high-stakes adventure filled with tension, emotion, and the kind of raw storytelling that only Hell Angel stories can provide.